The Pyromancer's Scroll by Jeremy P. Matson. Read by the author. Music by C.J. Matson. Chapter 16. Details. Savin may have changed. Halorn may have changed. The whole world may have changed in the last 7 years. But Durin, at least, finally felt like his old self again. Upon returning from Caradel, he spent another day shopping in Imperium's finest markets. After spending a good portion of the silver Lord Saladar had given him, Durin was as fully equipped as he'd been in his best days in the past. He wore a newly tailored combat outfit, a highly crafted blend of chainmail and padded leather, adorned with red silk highlights. The outfit would afford him a decent degree of protection while not overly restricting his movement. A new sword hung from his belt. The long saber had an intricate pattern of curves etched along the blade and the handguard. It was specifically designed to be a pyromancer's weapon, with the curves helping to capture and channel energy. It had taken some hunting to find a capable swordsmith who wouldn't recognize him, but at last he'd found one who'd recently moved to the capital. Durin had traded his tattered travel cloak for a new one of the traditional pyromantic design, one side scarlet, the other side sable black. He wore the scarlet side out as he strode along an aerial dock built high above the city's streets. An airship was tethered at the end of the dock, its crew busy making repairs to some fins on the port side. Interesting, Durin thought as he took in the strange ship. This was the first time he'd seen one up close. How exactly did it defy gravity to stay aloft? Looking more closely, he saw a large fire pan in the middle of the boat, directly underneath the fabric funnel leading to the giant balloon above. Did the fire pan heat the air in the balloon? He knew that hot air rose while cooler air sank, but would hot air really be enough to keep the massive vessel in the sky? He looked over the crew. While many looked to be Hakiru by their manner of dress, the rest were a motley assortment of different nationalities. But, based on the confident way they held their weapons and moved about the ship, these were all trained warriors who knew what they were about. Saladar had chosen well. "Hail, Pyromancer!" said a small voice. Durin looked down to see a garishly dressed Snippen scurry towards him. "Are you the skilled professional we are expecting?" He bowed. "You may call me Reinhardt." "Ensign Twiggly." The Snippen bowed with a flourish. "I'll be serving as your interpreter." She gestured toward a griffin swooping down for landing on the dock. "This is our leader, Wing Captain Bladebeak. And here comes our navigator." A male aviator was climbing down the rope ladder, whistling as he came. He was easily the fanciest dressed member of the whole crew, with a tailored vest and kilt made from a checkerboard green and red cloth. Durin recognized the fabric as a textile called a tartan, from a land far to the east. The aviator gave a jaunty smile and reached out a hand. "Name is Tach McLeary," he said, his accent thick. "I be afraid I don't know Lurian too well. Still learning Hakiru, as matter of fact." Durin stared at the outstretched hand, confused. Did the aviator want something? Money? Tach rolled his eyes. "You shake it." He grabbed his hand with his other hand and gave it a firm shake. "Like this. Ach, you Westerners will never understand a good handshake." "Tach comes from a Durinian clan, across the first Eastern Sea," Twiggly explained. "He had developed a reputation there as one of their finest navigators, until we picked him up a year ago." Tach winked. "They kidnapped me." The Snippen folded her furry arms over her chest. "More like, we gave you an offer you couldn't refuse. With an emphasis on the couldn't refuse part. But we're wasting sunbeams. What's the plan, Reinhardt?" Durin looked around, making sure there was no one else on the dock besides the pirates. "We must talk discreetly. This city is full of spies, many of whom are talented mancerers who could eavesdrop from afar. I assume the basics of this job have already been explained to you?" Twiggly turned and exchanged a few words with Bladebeak in Hakiru. Durin had never studied that language. It sounded like total gibberish to his ears, completely unrelated to Lurian, Mitrian, or any of the other several languages Durin had studied. Twiggly turned back. "You sail with us to the city of wherever. We kidnap the fancy-schmancy leader of wherever, sail back, turn her over to our employer for 200 pounds of gold. Straightforward." Durin nodded, reaching into his pack and pulling out a couple maps. "Yes, but let's go over some details." "Ah," said Tach, the Durinian navigator. "Details. The demons are always in the details." Demons. The conversation with Halorn from 3 days earlier flashed through Durin's mind. He He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. It was broad daylight. No demons would be out during daylight. First, let's talk about our approach to the capital of wherever, Durin said, spreading out a detailed map of central Elandria. Tak shook his head. No good. You're on a cloud frigate now, not a horse. You need a proper wind shot. Lucky for you, I came prepared. He pulled a map out of his satchel, spreading it out on the boardwalk and laying weights on the corners. While Durin vaguely recognized the terrain of Elandria from various landmarks, the chart was covered with an unintelligible sprawl of lines, arrows, and annotations. These show the wind currents over our target, Tak explained, pointing out various markings. The rest are notes about storm conditions, weather patterns, updrafts and downdrafts, likely pressure fronts, and useful way stations. He indicated the Rugaran Mountains, which formed the northern and western borders of central Elandria. This range is a natural barrier, hard to get over. We typically stay west or south of it, but there are some half-treacherous avenues we can use. Half-treacherous? Durin repeated, glancing at the Durinian and raising an eyebrow. Not sure I like the sound of that. I already had one brush with death in those mountains. Would it be safer to go around? Sure as beetles 'twould be, the Durinian said, shrugging. But where's the fun in that? Durin stared at Tak for a second. Then he smiled. You lot are my kind of sailors. Durin turned back to the map, studying the route Tak had indicated. The trick will be approaching the capital without being seen, he commented. They can't know we're coming. We're not too concerned about being spotted, Twiggly interjected. Cloud ships are an uncommon sight in wherever, true, but common enough that anyone will just think us to be a merchant vessel straying off the normal trade routes. As long as our final approach to the target is kept on the down low, we'll have a decent shot. That's where your expertise comes in, Reinhardt. Durin tapped a point on the map. I recommend approaching the capital from due north. That way, we'll avoid the Silvermoss and Ingerflood, and all the major roads and settlements, and travel over some sparsely populated hill country. Tak examined the map. The winds are pathetic for a north approach, but if we tack and churn, we could make it work. Durin had no idea what tack and churn meant, but he continued on as if he knew exactly what the Durinian navigator was talking about. Right. We'll want to approach at night, circle around the palace on the east side, then come to the southernmost tower. He pulled out a second map, this one specifically of the palace complex in Savin. The living quarters for our target are relatively isolated in a freestanding tower on the south side. Most of the garrison is quartered on the north side, by the palace gates. If we strike quickly and silently, we can overwhelm any guards in the south wing, seize our target, and slip away. Twiggly sucked on her paw as she stared at the map. She didn't seem to be doing much translation anymore. We'll have to work out some more specific tactics, but that can be done on the flight over. What do we do once we have our target? Slip away fast, Durin said. Could you escape griffin pursuit at night? We've developed some tricks, the Snimpin said, waving her paw dismissively. With cloud cover, it would be a breeze, but we can manage even without. Excellent, Durin said. We'll leave a ransom note behind, setting up a time and place for one of our griffins to meet with them to discuss terms of payment. But I thought we're taking our target back here, Twiggly said. We are, said Durin. But her people must not know that. We need to make it seem like you're acting independently, just kidnapping her so you can exchange her for a hefty price. They can't be any the wiser until we've returned here and handed the target over to your employer. And once she's brought here, will she ever be returned to her people? Or is she a prisoner for life? That's up to your employer to decide, Durin said. The real answer sat uncomfortably in his gut. Lord Saladar had given him secret orders to ensure Queen Everborn didn't reach any destination alive. Wiggly frowned, then turned to the griffin and exchanged a long back and forth with him. Then she turned back. It seems a little cruel to rob a kingdom of their queen and a queen of her kingdom. You're pirates, said Durin flatly. Don't you do cruel things all the time? Twiggly brushed a speck of dirt from her scarf. Only when occupationally necessary. Well, this is occupationally necessary, said Durin. Twiggly nodded thoughtfully, studying the maps as she tapped absently on the stones under her paws. That's a long flight back here, with few favorable air currents, she said. What's to say we simplify things somewhat and just ransom her back to her own people? I'm sure they'll pay a similar price as His Excellency, if not higher. And it saves us quite a bit of sailing. She winked at him. We could give you a hefty cut of the profits. Durin opened his mouth, but he didn't have a reply ready. This option had never occurred to him. From the pirate's perspective, Twiggly's alternative was much more attractive. But not to Durin. He wasn't doing this for the gold. If he double-crossed Saladar, Kymar's scroll would be forever out of his reach. Twiggly leaned forward and rapped playfully on Durin's knee. I'm just kidding with you, Renthart. We made a deal with His Excellency. And a deal's a deal. Durin studied the Snippin carefully. He wasn't sure he fully trusted her. The Griffin and the Navigator, at least, seemed straightforward. But this Snippin, she was a little too cavalier for his liking. Durin shrugged the thought aside. All he needed was for the pirates to help him successfully kidnap Adara. After that, it wouldn't matter what their plans were. His plans would take precedence. That sums things up. Durin folded up his maps. We'll discuss more in the air, when we're well away from any listening ears. When will you be ready to depart? This very afternoon, said Twiggly. We'll have the last rigging in tip-top shape within the hour, and the ship's already victualled and watered. So they were punctual, too. Ready the exact day Saladar had asked them to be. I'll return shortly, Durin said. I just want to check on my horse one more time. Make sure the stable hands are taking good care of her. Why leave her here? Twiggly asked. We could take her on board with us. Durin glanced between her and the cloud ship's tiny gondola, not sure how to respond to such a ludicrous proposal. Are you sure? It's a full-grown mare, and we have a long... He paused, noticing the smile trying to escape from the Snippin's mouth. Very funny, he finally said. I'm just trying to get you to laugh, Renthart, Twiggly smirked, taking out one of her daggers and twirling it on her paw. It's good for your health. Durin stood and shouldered his pack. I'm afraid professional pyromancers don't laugh unless paid double. It's an added service. Durin strode back down the dock, descended a set of stairs to an alley that would lead back to the main street, and found himself face to face with a familiar but completely unexpected face. Halorn, Durin said, startled. Hello again. Halorn had an old traveling cloak and a travel pack, but otherwise was still dressed in his simple farming garb. Why, I didn't tell you everything, Halorn said quickly. Back at Caradel, there was more I needed to say. Durin glanced up at the aerial docks. How had Halorn tracked him here? He'd taken extra precautions to make sure he hadn't been followed through the city. And how would Halorn have even found him in the first place? You lied the other day, Durin concluded. You must still dabble in pyromancy. You used it to track me here. Halorn shook his head. No pyromancy? Well, there are other ways of tracking someone. Then you hid a tracking gem in my pack when I visited your farm. Again, Halorn shook his head. Durin was at a loss. Then... I used a power higher than Mancery, said Halorn. I used the power of light. It took a second for Durin to process what Halorn was alluding to. When he did, he took a step back in alarm, summoning a crackling flame of fire. You've joined the Luminant Order, Durin said. That shepherd in the mountains was more than a storyteller. She must have been an adherent of the Order that escaped the Empire's purge. It was through the Order's arcane powers that you tracked me down. Halorn's face showed no sign of fear. The Order is not corrupt, Durin. We have been persecuted out of fear and jealousy, and because our allegiance is to an authority beyond Kalamar's throne. You know the Luminant Order is forbidden. Durin increased the flame in his hand until it roared over a foot tall. Anyone discovered to be an adherent is to be arrested and imprisoned. I could turn you in. But you won't, said Halorn. Durin stared at his friend for a few seconds, his thoughts jumbled. Then he realized that Halorn was right. He relaxed his stance and let the flame in his hand die. What do you need to tell me? He said grudgingly. I didn't give the whole truth about why I left the guild 7 years ago, Halorn said. Yes, I was getting disillusioned, but mainly I left because I didn't want to become like you. Something twisted deep within Durin's heart. What do you mean? Durin whispered. You were my best friend, Halorn explained. You were my role model, my inspiration. You faced every challenge with nothing but confidence. You made the hardest pyromantic tricks look like child's play. Every day I thought about how much I wanted to be like you. Halloran's face gained a look of pain and loss. But then, the guild changed you, Durin. You let it change you. As you grew in skill, you naturally acquired the hardest jobs, which were inevitably the most scurrilous. I saw how you stooped to anything that would increase your power and further your career. You became a pawn of Lord Saladar, doing his dirty work with scarcely a thought about those you harmed. I saw how those tasks started to make you hard, cold, and ruthless. Halloran looked down at his feet. But what scared me most was realizing I was walking that same path. You had once been a man of honor. So had I. But then you began to stoop to tasks far below your honor. So was I. Halloran took a deep breath. When he resumed, his voice was tight with barely constrained emotion. I began to wonder just how far you were willing to go. And that was when you killed King Everborn. Durin's insides twisted harder. How did you know? The words escaped him before he could stop them. First, I guessed, said Halloran. The timing seemed too coincidental. You disappeared without a trace. 1 month later, the king of Elandria was dead, supposedly killed by a tragic fire. So first, I just put 2 and 2 together. But I kept my ears open, and soon I eavesdropped on 2 guildmasters speculating on whether you had been killed by Everborn's guards. So his best friend knew he was a murderer. Durin's legs began to shake. He sunk down on a barrel, placed his hands on his knees, and stared at the cobblestones. You knew, he whispered. You knew this whole time. He looked up. Who else knows? I have no idea, Halloran shrugged. Many, I'm sure, suspected, but the guildmasters were exceedingly careful to keep your mission a secret. They had to be, if they wanted their plan to succeed. Durin furrowed his brow in confusion. But it already had. Halloran shook his head. That wasn't their whole plan. Like Saladar, they wanted King Everborn assassinated, yes. But they also wanted to absolve themselves of any involvement. And, perhaps most importantly for them, they wanted you dead. Durin grew chill. Halloran continued. I assume you haven't heard about what happened here after you left? Durin shook his head. Soon after you disappeared, but before King Everborn's death, the Guild Council denounced you. Denounced me? They issued a declaration. It was read in the academy and posted in several city squares. They declared that you had become dangerous and deranged, and so had been evicted from the guild, barred from any employment, and placed under warrant of arrest. They said you had disappeared, and that they had reason to suspect you were going to attempt something crazy if not found and captured. Durin stared into the shadows of the alley, letting the information sink in. Halloran kept talking. You were only a tool, Durin, but you were a dangerous and ambitious tool that they needed to get rid of as soon as it had done its job. They and Lord Saladar wanted King Everborn dead, to spark a war that would further their interests. But they wanted to obscure any evidence of their involvement. So they cut all their ties with me, Durin realized. It all makes sense now, Halloran. My instructions were to assassinate King Everborn in a public, showy fashion, declaring that I had been sent by Calamar. Halloran nodded. I suspected as much. Durin began to pace, thinking out loud. Whether I succeeded or not, they wanted Elandria to accuse Calamar of being behind the assassination. The Emperor, the Vizier, and the Guild would all deny it. Denouncing me was a necessity. Friendheart, they would say. Ah yes, look at this edict we issued. We knew he was dangerous, and we tried to capture him. We're so sorry this happened. Halloran nodded again. Our citizens would believe the lie. Elandria's wouldn't. And so war would ensue, with Elandria perceived as the unjustified aggressor. But instead, Durin said, King Everborn's advisors decided to hush up the assassination, and pretend the king died in an accident. Halloran nodded. And they were wise. It bought them 4 more years of unstable peace, until war finally broke out 3 years ago. Puzzle pieces from 7 years ago began falling into place in Durin's head. I didn't travel to Savin alone. I went with another member of the guild. The day I raided the palace, he was supposed to be waiting at the river with a boat to help me slip away. But when I arrived at the docks, with pursuit hot on my tail, he was gone. All part of the guildmaster's plan, most likely, Halloran said. They wanted Elandria to capture you and find out who sent you. And then, they wanted you dead. Emotions ripped through Durin. Betrayal. Anger. Hate. He summoned a flame, a thin column of intense heat that rose 3 feet above his hand. Then he let his hatred pour into it like oil, stoking it hotter and hotter until the core burned blue. They will pay, Durin spat. Those cowards will pay. Halorn approached Durin, carefully skirting around his incinerating inferno, and put a hand on Durin's shoulder. Durin, I didn't tell you this so that you could get revenge. Revenge? Durin snarled. Or justice? They sought my life. Why should I not seek theirs? Because it will destroy you. Halorn passed a hand through Durin's column of fire. In an instant, the flame died. Durin had never felt anything like it before. There was no counterspell, no competing pyromantic pull, not even the suck of voidstone. The heat and energy just vanished. Durin sprang backward, staring in shock at his friend. How did you do that? By the same power I knew where to find you. Halorn fixed Durin with his intense gaze. Now, I have one more question, Durin. What have you thought about what I shared with you? About angels and demons? About the void? About your eternal soul? Hatred and anger towards the men who had betrayed him still coursed through his mind. What does that have to do with anything? Durin snapped. Everything. Halorn placed a finger on Durin's chest. You are no mere mortal, Durin. None of us are. We are infinite beings. And you need to decide where you want to spend infinity. Halorn pointed up at the afternoon sky. In the halls of the sun? He pointed down. Or in the pits of the void? Durin shook his head. That's not... Don't you see? Halorn cried. Don't you understand? You murdered a king in cold blood. You helped spark a war that has claimed tens of thousands of lives. And you think, when you die, that these abominable acts won't matter? I did not start this war, Durin said. Oh, said Halorn. What did you think you were doing 7 years ago? Durin had no answer. He had told himself he had killed Everborn to defend Calamar's interests, to give Elandria a warning, to fulfill the Emperor's wishes. But he had never fully thought through what his act would bring upon the world. The truth was, he had done it solely so he could get his hands on Kaimar's scroll. The silence weighed heavily in the air before Halorn continued, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Then you better think harder this time, Durin, before you kill Everborn's daughter. He can't know. Durin's mind filled with panic. His meetings with Saladar had been completely private. Saladar always took every precaution. No one, Mancerer or otherwise, could have overheard them. I know your orders from Saladar, Halorn continued. Work with the pirates to kidnap Queen Adara. Then set their cloud ship on fire and let the queen and the crew burn or fall to their deaths, while you use your pyromantic prowess to leap to safety. Durin's mind raced. There was no way Halorn could know. No mechanism by which Halorn could have overheard. Unless everything Halorn had said was true. Unless invisible angels really were witnessing Durin's every act, and they were the source of Halorn's knowledge. But if that part of Halorn's beliefs was true, then everything else was, too. The angels see all. Everything. Tyranny and murder. Act, do not wait. Seal the scroll of your fate. Deal rightly with all, or to the void you will fall. In an instant, Durin's world had tipped upside down. Everything was in pandemonium. He tried in vain to sort through the shambles, grasping at the thousands of questions coursing through him. Finally, he settled on one. Why did the guildmasters want me dead? Halorn reflected for a moment. I think it was 3 reasons. First was jealousy. They didn't want you to outshine them. It would have stripped them of their power and influence. Durin nodded. He had already gathered as much. Second, they knew you wanted something they couldn't offer you. Kaimar's 6th scroll, Durin said. They didn't want me to access its secrets. Not exactly, said Halorn. They couldn't offer it to you because they do not have it. What? What under the million stars was Halloran talking about? Everyone knows that Kymar R'hllyn made only a single copy of his last scroll, Halloran said. Kymar forbade his acolytes from ever copying it. According to tradition, that scroll was handed down through generations of pyromantic masters, kept in the most secret vaults of the Academy down to the present. Exactly, said Durin. It's a lie, Halloran said. The lorekeeper told me the truth. Kymar didn't entrust the scroll to Kalimar. He entrusted it to Elandria. Absurdity, Durin shook his head. Kalimar was Kymar's homeland. Kalimar was where he founded his academy. Think about it, said Halloran. In 300 years, has any master of the guild displayed the hidden powers that scroll is supposed to unlock? None, said Durin. But that's because the powers are too advanced. Halloran held up a finger. Advanced, yes, but not impossible. No. According to tradition, the reason Kymar made a single copy, the reason he ordered it hidden, was because he feared those secrets would make someone too powerful. Then why hasn't Elandria used these powers to win the war? Because they understand what Kymar understood, said Halloran. Power, once placed in the wrong hands, cannot be wrested back. The scroll is kept with utmost secrecy. Only a handful of people know it even exists in their archives. And do you know where it is? No, said Halloran. I didn't tell you this so you could seek it, Durin. I told you so you would stop seeking it. It is out of your grasp, unattainable. Perhaps, Durin said, the wheels in his mind already turning. He knew the layout of the palace at Savin well, including the location of its library. Perhaps while the pirates kidnapped the queen? I know what you're thinking, Halloran said. But the scroll is not in the royal palace. It's not anywhere in Savin. I know that much. Elandria is vast. It could be anywhere within their kingdom. Give up your quest. Never, Durin thought, but he did not voice it out loud. What was the third reason you think the guildmasters wanted me dead? Halloran looked relieved to be changing the subject. The third reason was that you were too closely under the thumb of Saladar. While the guildmasters share many of His Excellency's foreign policies, they are keen to maintain their independence. Admitting you to their council would have given Saladar too much power over them. Durin blew out a breath. Then His Excellency, at least, is still an ally. Halloran shook his head. He is no ally of yours, Durin. He sees you only as a tool. His favor extends only as far as you are useful to him. You do not know His Excellency like I do, said Durin. I know enough, said Halloran. I know he started a war for no reason than personal power. The war is over Haber, Durin protested. There are other ways to fix the Haber shortage than going to war, Halloran said. Haber is the excuse. Ambition is the reason. No, Durin. Saladar has no one's interests in mind except his own. Following him will only lead to pain. And following anything but this, Halloran tapped Durin's chest above his heart, will only lead to darkness. Durin's mind was still drowning in questions. Halloran had answered one, but prompted 1,000 more. But before he could ask another, Halloran's head jerked up. Someone is coming, he said. I must go. With surprising speed, Halloran slipped farther down the alley, disappearing around a corner. Durin stood in shock for a moment, still trying to process all that had happened in the last 15 minutes. Too late, he reached out with his pyrosense to detect what Halloran had. Immediately, he felt it. A trio of figures approaching the entrance to the alley, one of whom with a spark that felt very, very familiar. It was too late to hide as Halloran had. Durin turned to face the new arrivals as they reached the entrance to the alley. He bowed deeply at their leader. Greetings, Your Excellency. Rendhart, said Lord Saladar, with a hint of surprise. Impeccable timing. Come, our plans have changed.